Hi, very good afternoon. My sincere apologies for the delay for a few minutes. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
So sorry, I had a client with some emergency. I had to sort of speak with them. So sorry about the delay.
No issue, sir.
Do we commence today's session directly?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please
Are
do.
we waiting for somebody or?
No, sir.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So, a very good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for joining. For those who attended yesterday's session, I hope you found it useful. We are going to continue in our conversation and cover off primarily the law on sexual harassment today, right? But I would like to pick off on one concept that I didn't finish yesterday, which was to deal with restrictive covenants in Indian law, and then move on to the subject of workplace sexual harassment or the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act. So without further ado, let me start off where we left yesterday, which is on the issue of restrictive covenants. Uh, so I'm sure all of you, I imagine our students who have already learned contract law, right? Uh, Indian contract law, section 27 specifically, talks about non-compete restrictions, right? And it says that any covenant in restraint of trade is void. So that has been interpreted quite consistently by Indian courts over the years, who have said that any sort of restraint on an employee, which prevents him from working with a competitor after his or her employment with the organization has come to an end, is void, correct? Now, position for many years, uh, even though our contract law. Uh, Sorry, I'm getting a bad network message. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
Okay, great. Um, So even though our contract law was based on the English jurisprudence, right? UK has itself moved forward. They themselves have developed on this jurisprudence, but we haven't really changed too much. Now, what that does is it creates complexity for organizations on how they can safeguard their interests, right? Specifically when they have senior employees quit and move out of an organization and potentially try and compete with them in difficult and challenging legal markets. Um, Now, there is one exception in the context of Section 27, which states that in the limited context of a sale of goodwill, there can be a non-compete restriction that is imposed. So for those of you who might be familiar with M&A transactions or corporate deals where somebody is buying out the ownership, right, of the promoters or the original investors, uh, you could argue that there is a sale of the goodwill of the original promoters or investors in that legal entity. And those individuals, right, even though they might be employed by that individual, very often you have founders who are also employees, correct? Those individuals can then be subjected to reasonable non-compete restrictions, essentially stopping them from competing with the very business that they've just sold, right, to a new purchaser or buyer, correct? That's the sort of limited context in which we've seen non-competes being enforceable in the Indian context. There have been few rulings where courts have made some passing remarks. I wouldn't say they are established law, but there are few rulings where courts have suggested that in fixed term contracts, where an employee is working for an organization for a fixed tenure, and there is a commitment from both sides that they will be expected to fulfill that tenure, right? There isn't any sort of provision which allows them to, cut short that arrangement. Courts have said that if someone breaches that covenant and tries to walk out of the relationship, there could be an argument to make that they should be allowed to enforce that non-compete for the remainder of the original tenure. We haven't really seen too much jurisprudence on this, however, so any such position can come with a risk. Please note that restrictive covenants can be of various forms and shapes. Non-compete is one kind of a restrictive covenant which prevents an individual from competing with the ex-employer. There could be other forms of covenants such as non-solicitation, confidentiality restrictions, non-hire provisions, which also extend beyond the terms of employment, right? Let's look at some case studies to get your sense and understanding of how these work. So if you look at this case study, Janki became an employee of company A in 2009 and signed an employment contract with the company. Company A was providing software related services. She also signed a non-solicitation agreement with this company, which provided that she cannot solicit the company's employees for a period of 12 months after she's left the company. The contract also included a clause which said that she could not be involved in any kind of business activity which was in competition with company A and its core business within the same geographical area for a period of 12 months after she's quit. Now her services were terminated in 2012. After her employment was terminated, she set up a company on similar lines as company A within the same city and in close proximity as well, right? She put up a hoarding outside her office and advertisements on job portals stating vacancy for experienced software engineers. Now, company A felt that the non-compete clause was reasonably drafted, considering it was restricted to a fixed geographical area and only for 1 year. Now, they wanted to initiate legal proceedings against Janki for the breach of the non-compete clause as well as the non-solicitation clause. Now, what is the court likely to hold on both these grounds? Any volunteers who are willing to try answering this? Kanishk, are you there?
Yeah. So Sridhar, you can go ahead.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, I think that here the restraint can be held. In my opinion, I agree with company here that the restriction is reasonable. The restriction is only suited in only for a fixed geographical area, and the time period is reasonable as well. I think that here the court may hold in favor of company A, in my opinion.
On which claim? They are claiming that she's breached both the non-compete and the non-solicit clause. So you're saying that company A will succeed in enforcing which provision?
I think that the non-compete clause is valid. I don't know. I'm not sure about the non-solicitation though.
Okay. Does anyone else have an opinion on this?
Yeah. Sharanya, you can go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So I think that the non-compete clause will not be upheld and the non-solicitation clause will be held valid by the court.
Thanks. Can you elaborate your answer?
Because the restrictions that are imposed uh, through the non-compete clause will not be held valid, as the courts have already set in precedent, while the non-solicitation clause is going to restrict Janki from using the uh, knowledge that she acquired at company A and the contacts and all. It will restrict her to use that to set up a competition. So I think that is the reason why she should be allowed.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anyone else have any answer to?
There are two more people. Amira, you can go ahead.
Hello, sir. So, as per my understanding of Section 27 of the Indian Contract Act, I think the non-compete clause will be held valid since it's only for 1 year and it has a very restricted geographical area. And so, as per the non-solicitation clause, I think I have a mixed opinion because till the time it is not interfering with her right to livelihood, it should be made invalid. But the minute she is taking, advantage of all the contacts that she has gained during the course of her employment, it should be held valid.
Okay.
Kavna, you can go next.
Good morning, good afternoon, sir. I have a very similar answer to others. I also feel that the non-solicit clause is valid because it's reasonable and she can't take clients from her previous company. But the non-compete clause, which was held for 1 year, is not valid because that will be restricting her right to livelihood and employment. That's it.
So may I ask, for the people who have said that the non-solicitation clause is enforceable here, in the facts that have been presented to you, do you actually see her soliciting anyone from company A?
No, sir.
How is she soliciting people from company A? What has she done here? She's just put up a hoarding outside her office and on job portal saying that she has vacancy for experienced software engineers. Why do you think she's soliciting people from company A? All right, so let me explain this further, right? Under Indian jurisprudence, a non-compete provision is not enforceable in India. The exceptions, right, to reasonable duration, geographic area, etc., only apply in the context of sale of goodwill transactions, right? This is not a situation where Janki has sold her business. Janki is just an employee with company. So the exception around sale of goodwill and the non-compete applying there for a reasonable
Sir, you are on mute.
Yes. Somebody muted me. Am I still on mute?
No,
No.
sir.
Okay, I don't know who, but somebody muted me. I hope I am audible now.
Yes, you are, sir.
Okay, so I don't know where I got put on mute, but let me repeat. The non-compete here will not be enforceable because the exception for the enforceability of non-competes in the context of sale of goodwill only recognizes the reasonable test where it has to be reasonable in terms of tenure and geography. That's not a general exception that applies to any and every non-compete provision, right? So keep that in mind. Don't get confused by the fact that it's just for 12 months or it's just for the same city. That exception and those rules only are in relation to sale of goodwill. Now, when it comes to non-solicitation, right? Fundamentally, courts have upheld non-solicitation provisions in India. they have said that non-solicitation provisions are different from non-compete. I can still earn a livelihood by working for a competitor, but by being faced by a non-solicit provision where I agree not to go back and poach my prior colleagues or clients is not going to be a restraint of trade, right? That's not going to prevent me from actually carrying out a job or a vacation. So non-solicitation provisions are actually enforceable. In this case, however, and that's where you need to pay attention to the facts, she's not actually actively soliciting anybody. She's just put up broad public facing advertisements inviting all experienced software engineers to apply to her organization, correct? They could be from company A, they could be from company X, they could be from company Y, correct? So if she was actually reaching out specifically to the employees of company A, right? She was using her connections, her old relationships with colleagues in that organization and directly targeting them. Then yes, by all means, she could have been prevented from doing so, because that would have been a breach of a non-solicit provision, but not otherwise. So public advertisements of this nature wouldn't violate a non-solicit obligation, correct? So let's move on. One last case study here. Naina became an employee of company A in 2009 and signed an employment contract with the organization. This company was providing services to another organization, company B, and had a contract between themselves. So this is a contract between company A and company B, where both parties agreed not to hire the employees of each other's companies, right? Now, sorry, this should be Naina, not Janki. After Naina's employment was terminated, she applied to company B, right, for a job. Now, company B rejected the same on the basis of the agreement that it had with company A, whereby company B had agreed that they will not hire each other's employees. Now, Naina decides to challenge the agreement between the parties. What is the court likely to hold here? Any views on this?
Kavna, go ahead, please.
Sir, I believe that the court will rule in favor of Naina because the contract is restricting her employment with another company.
Could you elaborate that further, please? Because over here, there is no company B, right? Isn't imposing any sort of restraint on her. Neither is company A, so to speak, directly restraining her. Correct. This is the agreement between two corporates at their level. How could you elaborate further on why you think this contract is not enforceable?
Because the contract between company A and B, where they don't accept employees from the other company, is stopping her from applying in that company after her after she stops working in this company. So that is what is restricting her right to employment and livelihood. So that is why I believe that the contract is not valid.
Great. So I think that's a sound logic. And in fact, this case study is based on a reported judgment where the court has also made a similar observation to say that such an agreement between the two companies, right, is anti-competitive because it is indirectly preventing the employees from joining the competing Valley in the US, where the big tech majors had these
Atul,
unwritten understanding among themselves.
Atul, I'm so sorry, but your voice wasn't coming for a good 20-30 seconds. So I think no one may have heard the analysis.
Now,
Now it's fine. Now it's fine.
Okay, great. So let me repeat myself. Your analysis is right. I think there is a clear argument to make over here that an agreement between two corporates, right, which essentially indirectly prevents people from seeking out jobs with certain organizations, is also anti-competitive. And there is in fact a reported ruling with a similar reasoning in India. In fact, this became a big issue in the Silicon Valley in the US, where a lot of the tech majors had this unwritten understandings with each other, saying that, I'm a Google employee, Hewlett Packard agrees that it will not hire Google employees, or, Google agrees that it will not hire employees from Apple or whatever, right? So all the big tech companies in Silicon Valley had this unwritten understanding amongst themselves, which also was argued to be anti-competitive. Thankfully, we don't see this quite often in India, but there are instances where non-hire provisions will be included in commercial contracts. And it's then important to flag to your clients that these types of arrangements might be unenforceable because they work as indirect non-competes, right? So with that, we are sort of done with this specific module. I would like to move on to the module relating to workplace sexual harassment, the POSH presentation. So is the presentation visible?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's spend the remainder of our time today on the subject of workplace sexual harassment. Now, bear in mind that the law is pretty wide, right? The workplace is where we're going to see this more often, but it applies across the board to all types of institutions, including educational institutions, right? Now, everyone has heard the term Me Too. It's had its beginnings through a tweet, right, from the Hollywood actress Alyssa Milano, and it assumed proportions of a global movement, right, in a very, very short period of time. And it's had significant impact on organizations, on organizational culture, and the way we do business, right? Look around. Sorry, someone saying something?
Hi, sir. If I may interrupt, before we begin with sexual harassment, I have a question on the previous restrictive covenants. Is it okay if I shoot it out now?
Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Hi. I'm Aditi. I'm working as a legal advisor with Task Outsourcing, which is basically a recruitment agency in India and across the Middle East. My question is with respect to non-compete. What would your opinion be if instead of putting a non-compete obligation in a non-compete clause, we route it through confidentiality and say that in the event tomorrow, after 12 months of termination of the employment agreement, the employee joins a competitor, we will have the right to seek enforcement of to seek injunctive relief if the employee reveals confidential information, since competition it would be harmful if the other person joins a competitor. Do you think in that case can we really play the devil's advocate and tomorrow get a possibly favorable order? Just trying to play the devil's advocate here.
No problem. Sure, that's a good question. Non-competes will remain unenforceable, right? So while confidentiality provisions are perfectly legal and binding, and you could very well choose to enforce a confidentiality provision, your remedy before a court will have to be on the basis.
So your voice is breaking. I could not gather the last few minutes.
Atul, your voice is breaking.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yeah, better.
Sorry. So I was saying that any remedy that you seek from the court will have to be on the strength of the actual confidentiality provision, right? You'll have to be able to demonstrate to a court that there has been a violation of the confidentiality norms, that there is a actual instance where your confidential information or data has been shared with the competitor, or a reasonable apprehension. And there too, right? In my experience, the court will not stop the person from pursuing a job with the competitor. They might jump or using your to actually get an order from a court to say that they're also going to restrain that person from working for the competing entity altogether.
Correct. Thanks. That answers my question. Thank you so much.
Sure. So just pardon me, give me 1 second, please. So thanks. So moving on, I was talking about the Me Too movement and the impact that it's had globally, right, including in India. I don't think a single day goes by today where some or the other significant news comes up, whereby senior individuals very often accused of having utilized their position in an organization to solicit sexual favors or otherwise engage in conduct which is in the nature of sexual harassment, right? Big names have suffered because of accusations of sexual harassment, right? You have examples right in front of you: MJ Akbar, Bini Bansal, KR Srinivas from TOI, multiple such names all over the world and in India have individually paid the price for having engaged in inappropriate workplace conduct, in sexual harassment of their colleagues. And not just those individuals, their very organizations have suffered, right? There are instances where entire organizations have had to shut down because their leaders engaged in such inappropriate conduct. And once they were called out, such conduct was called out, it resulted in significant loss of business, loss of face and publicity for that organization, correct? So, there are n number of examples today on this. And many of these people we have helped, these organizations we've been involved with in investigating their internal sexual harassment complaints and advising them on what's the best and the appropriate way to deal with it as per law. Now, these examples can go on, you could fill pages with these types of examples of people who have suffered, right? There's been a staggering number of CEO departures due to these types of behavior. Now, what comes across, therefore, is two things, right? One is it's an extremely prevalent issue. Unfortunately, it's an extremely prevalent issue in Indian workplaces and institutions of all kinds. And two, there is a need for significantly greater education on this subject, correct? Awareness is key. What we do when we are advising our clients, and this is a significant part of what we do on the employment side work front, is handhold organizations in creating sexual harassment policies and in spreading awareness about those policies, right? So training their employees, training their management, training the internal committee members on what the law and the contours around sexual harassment is and how they can most effectively deal with it, correct? With the objective of being compliant with the law and maintaining their reputation in the market, correct? So today's session, and as budding lawyers who are going to take up jobs with organizations and law firms or as independent practitioners, is to make you more familiar with the law on sexual harassment and how this applies in the context of the corporate world, correct? We'll deal with key concepts under the law, key definitions under the law. We'll try and revise them and understand them better through case studies and examples. And, again, this will be an interactive session where, I'll expect answers from you all to the case studies that I put up, correct? Now, sexual harassment is essentially dealt with in the criminal jurisprudence as well as in the civil jurisprudence in India, right? So with the Nirbhaya incident that occurred in 2013, the Indian government sort of was sort of catalyzed into creating the legal framework around it, right? They amended the Indian Penal Code and introduced Section 354A, which criminalized sexual harassment, punishable with imprisonment up to 3 years or with a fine or both. The Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act, right? Quite a mouthful. But the POSH law, or the SH Act as it's commonly referred to, was also enacted. What this does is it creates the civil side of things where the internal disciplinary measures, where there is disciplinary action that could be taken against the accused employee, potentially up to termination from employment, right? And as part of this law, it's now mandatory for organizations to create sexual harassment policies and deal with sexual harassment as a disciplinary matter, correct? There is a specific framework laid down in the law, a special procedure and framework laid down in the law to deal with this. Now, what's the history of this law?
Atul, we can't hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Sorry, I think the network is acting up a little bit at my end. Kanishk, please let me know immediately if my network is falling, right? Either through this conversation or by separately messaging me. But right, apologies for that. Let me get the presentation back up. Yeah, so we ratified the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination of all forms of elimination of discrimination against women, right? This required us actually to set up a law on sexual harassment. Now, India dragged its feet on it till 2013 eventually. But before we could even get around to creating any sort of draft laws, the Supreme Court in the Vishaka case, and it's a well-known case, I'm sure all students would have read or studied it at a point of time. In the 1997 Vishaka versus State of Rajasthan case, they actually laid down the framework for how organizations should be dealing with workplace sexual harassment. In fact, it's this very framework that now has found place in the Sexual Harassment Act with certain tweaks, right? So from Vishaka till 2013, India dragged its feet on creating the law. There were various bills that were discussed, put into cold storage, debated again. Eventually, it was the Nirbhaya incident in Delhi, which ultimately, like I said, catalyzed the government into passing this law, correct? In December 2013. Now, one thing to bear in mind, and this is something which has been criticized in various circles, is that the law is not gender neutral, correct? So it's specifically in its very name, right? It's a law for prevention of sexual harassment of women alone, right? It doesn't deal with any other gender. It doesn't deal with male employees. It doesn't deal with transgenders, which in a sense is a failing of the law, because globally we have seen that sexual harassment can be gender agnostic. While it is no doubt true that women have historically and continue to often be the victims of sexual harassment, most progressive organizations and clients, right, that we deal with choose to voluntarily create gender neutral harassment policies, correct? Allowing both men, women, and other genders like transgenders to come forward and bring out instances where they may have suffered harassment at the hands of their colleagues, irrespective of gender. But let's keep our discussion today in the context of what the law says, right, which is sexual harassment of women at the workplace. Let's spend some time discussing the definition as to what amounts to sexual harassment, correct? Now, the definition under this law is a two-pronged definition. There is section 2N, which you can see right now. There's also section 3, which expands the ambit of sexual harassment significantly. We'll deal with this through some case studies eventually, but primarily the elements of sexual harassment are there has to be unwelcome conduct of some kind. It could be direct or by implication, right? And it involves these specific types of activities, right? It could be physical contacts or advances, demand or request for sexual favors, making sexually colored remarks, showing pornography, any other unwelcome physical, verbal or non-verbal conduct of sexual nature, right? So this is dealing with how you would put it, the act, the very act, the words, the physical action, or some other manifestation, right, of the act of sexual harassment. Now, what section 3 does is it expands the circumstances in which conduct could amount to sexual harassment. So section 3 says that these circumstances, right, if they are present in relation to or connected with any act or behavior of sexual harassment, right, as we just discussed under section 2N, could also amount to sexual harassment, which means if there is any form of implied or explicit promise or preferential treatment in employment, implied or explicit threat of detrimental treatment in employment, implied or explicit threat about present or future employment status, interference with the victim's work, creating an intimidating or offensive or a hostile work environment for her, or any kind of humiliating treatment likely to affect her health or safety, right? Now, it might not be immediately clear to you as to how these definitions work with each other, correct? We're going to try and do some case studies to better understand these definitions and their interplay. but you know, it helps for you to look at these slides a little bit more, sort of imbibe these elements, right? There has to be unwelcome direct or implied conduct of this nature, and where such nature exists, and these other circumstances are also arguably present, correct? And that also expands the situations in which you might argue that Deepa, audio failed again, Kanish. Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's look at this case study, right? Did you hear the analysis up until now? Kanishka, do I need to repeat something?
I think you will need to repeat the interplay between the main ingredients and the manner it's been broadened.
No, so thanks. So I haven't gone into that interplay yet. What I was saying was, let's understand that interplay through some case studies, correct? So let's look at this one. Deepa is the only female member in the marketing team. She informs her supervising manager, Karan, in December 2015 that she's pregnant and will go on leave starting May 2016. A new project which has to be completed in the next 2 months has just come up. Deepa has been showing interest in working on this project, and despite that interest, Karan assigned the project to Ramesh, who is another member of his team. Now, I would like you to, and maybe, you know, because there are multiple case studies, I like maybe 2 answers or max 3 answers per case study. Does anyone here believes that this amounts to sexual harassment?
Sridhar, you can go ahead.
Yes, sir, I don't think that this amounts to sexual harassment, as the decision was made purely based on the requirements of the project, and I don't think that the fact that Deepa is a woman or she's going to go on leave in May influence the decision in any way. So I don't think this can be classified as sexual harassment.
Bhavna, you can go.
Yeah.
So the facts of the case say that she'll be going on leave starting in May, and this was assigned in December. So she had a lot of time to, and this project has to be completed within 2 months. So she had a lot of time to take part in the project, whereas she wasn't allowed. So I feel there is sexual harassment because we can see. We can see preferential treatment in her employment. That's why I feel there is sexual harassment.
Preferential or detrimental?
I'm not sure.
Interesting. So firstly, do you believe any of these elements exist in these facts? Has there been any kind of unwelcome conduct of this nature?
No, sir.
Okay. So do you still believe that this amounts to sexual harassment?
I'm not sure. I refer to the slide after that, and based on that, I came to an answer. The implied or explicit promise of.
Correct. So what does this say? This says that if these circumstances occur or are present in relation to or connected with any act of sexual harassment, right? So there has to be something some conduct or behavior which falls under this definition to start with. Right? What exists or what has been laid out in section 3 can exist around such conduct, right? Or could be in addition to such conduct, or be circumstances surrounding the offensive sexual harassment conduct. But stand alone by itself, right? If I have a colleague and I give them some form of allegedly detrimental treatment, right? Where there is no other sexual harassment, will be difficult to hold as sexual harassment under the ambit of this law. So to clarify, it would be difficult for Deepa to say over here that her manager, right, Karan, has sexually harassed her. She could very well try and claim that she was let go of this project because of her status as a woman, or because maybe Karan didn't think she would be able to do it because of her pregnant status. Right? That could form a completely different type of claim, right? Probably one relating to workplace general harassment or discrimination, or gender bias in a way. But does this amount to sexual harassment in the ambit of this law? Probably not. And I think this is a very important distinction to make. And I've seen that very often people confuse these two concepts simply because the person raising the issue or the allegation is a woman, correct? So it's important we don't confuse these two because the implications of accusing someone of sexual harassment, right, can be quite severe, correct? There could be criminal prosecution, there could be disciplinary action resulting in loss of job, correct? So we need to bear in mind that if we are actually treating or accusing someone of sexual harassment and inquiring into that, then we believe at some level that in fact the elements of these definitions are sort of satisfied, correct? Now let's take a look at this.
Atul, one second. Dr. Rissam wants to say something. Dr. Rissam, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to put my words on this particular case study only. I particularly feel that this thing clearly nowhere reflects the case of sexual harassment, because it is purely done considering her health condition, and moreover, this particular project requires to be completed within a particular time frame, and that may later on hamper her health as well as the working of this project. So there's no case of sexual harassment, as you clearly said, that nothing falls under the said section also.
Correct, sir. That's right. Right. These are, of course, very subjective assessments. These are all case studies meant to help bring out certain, points of law. In reality, when we are dealing with these types of subjects, it's extremely subjective. But yes, you're absolutely right. As I said, in these facts and circumstances, there is no mention anywhere of Karan engaging in any kind of sexually inappropriate behavior, correct? So let's look at these case studies. Is it sexual harassment if it's not actually targeted towards the person who comes forward with a complaint? Now let's examine that. And here you will see the interplay between section 2 and section 3. Now, the IT team in a company has created a WhatsApp group to share work updates and to fix meetings, correct? Santosh forwards a sexually explicit joke to all members of his team on this group. Rita, who is also on the group and receives this joke, feels uncomfortable and files a complaint of sexual harassment. Now, is this sexual harassment? Any two volunteers?
Sridhar, go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. Sir, I think that this can be construed as sexual harassment because of the fact that it was the message was forwarded in an official group where all the employees were chatting, were contacting each other, and I think that if the contents of the joke are such that they're very offensive, then maybe there is a case of sexual harassment.
So would it matter here that the joke was not targeted at Rita? Because it's a general joke sent to everyone on the group.
Yes, sir, but if the joke is in poor taste, then maybe there can be a case. This is a little dicey. I'm not 100% sure about what should be done in this situation.
So that's the reason why the interplay between these definitions becomes important. Now, if you were to try and look at it from a lawyer's perspective, right? From Rita's perspective, was there unwelcome sexually inappropriate behavior? She was at the workplace. She was using a work WhatsApp chat group, and it's a work group, so you wouldn't expect sexually colored jokes or remarks to be bandied about on it. And she finds one fine day that a colleague is sending such kind of behavior. So there is unwelcome sexually colored remarks, right, that she's been subjected to. So we agree that the elements of section 2N exist, right? Now, now the problem is Santosh might say, listen, I didn't even know Rita was a part of the group. It's a big organization. There are hundreds of people on this group. I don't even know who she is. How can you accuse me of sexually harassing her, right? What do you say to that? And does section 3 then have a role to play? Is there something in this section which would strengthen the claim that Rita has, that she has been legitimately, she has the legitimate right to raise that issue under this law?
Sir, I think that maybe the fact that it's creating an hostile and work environment for her, the fact that maybe can be an issue raised by Rita in this present situation.
Correct, exactly, that's right. So I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, but I think you've got the analysis.
Yes, sir, I'm Sridhar.
Yeah, you've got the analysis right in this case. So as you can see here, it's a work environment, right? People go to work to work. People go to the office to do their roles, responsibilities and duties. They don't go there to be subjected to sexually offensive behavior, correct? So very well, Santosh might say that, I didn't know of Rita, I didn't even direct it to her. But his workplace conduct on an official platform is creating an offensive work environment for his colleagues, right? His female colleagues. So over here, even though the conduct was not directed at Rita, she could very well file a complaint of sexual harassment against Santosh under this law. Let's take another example. While taking a coffee break at work, John makes personal phone calls in the pantry of the office. The conversations are loud, dirty, and liberally filled with obscene words, right? Other employees who frequent the pantry cannot help but overhear these conversations. So you've got this loudmouth making these, obscenity-ridden conversations in a public space in the office. One woman employee files a sexual harassment complaint against John. Is this sexual harassment?
Ameera, go ahead, please.
Yes, sir, this would amount to sexual harassment, or the analysis being similar to as Sridhar had mentioned earlier, that the workplace environment is getting affected because of him.
Correct. So there you see. So I hope these examples help you see the correlation between how these two definitions work, right? And how, even though the conduct might not be specifically targeted at a particular person, if it has if it is sexually inappropriate and it has the ability to create an intimidating, offensive or hostile work environment for your colleagues, then it certainly could fall within the ambit of sexual harassment. This jurisprudence is generally understood as in two forms. One is quid pro quo sexual harassment, where these other elements exist, where I might be somebody's supervisor or boss or colleague, and I behave in a sexually inappropriate manner under some form of threat or promise of either detrimental or preferential treatment, right? That's direct quid pro quo type of sexual harassment. And then there is the hostile work environment type of harassment, where I might not be directing my conduct or behavior to any one particular individual, but through my conduct, I'm making the environment toxic for my colleagues, right? Both of these amount to sexual harassment in the Indian context. Now, where India slightly differs from international jurisprudence is, in international jurisprudence, typically the elements of Section 3 also have to be demonstrated to exist in any and every allegation of sexual harassment, correct? Over here, these two sections are sort of disjointed. It might be a case where none of these elements of Section 3 are present, correct? That could also be a possibility. It would still amount to sexual harassment because it's satisfying the elements of Section 2N. Now let's look at this as a example. Two colleagues, Gokul and
in the PPT,
often seen flirting with each other. Sorry?
Your PPT, it's not on the case study.
Is it now?
No, it's the screen that's still the definition of SH.
How about now?
It's not getting updated.
Okay. Oh, the sharing has stopped for some reason. Give me a second. So let's look at personal relations, right? So two colleagues, Gokul and Shanta, are often seen flirting with each other at the workplace, the cafeteria.
Interrupt again. The PPT is still not come.
Still not coming.
No, PPT.
Sir, sorry to interrupt, but the PPT is visible to us.
PPT is visible, yes.
And then there is an issue at my end. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
No worries. All right. So let's look at this. Two colleagues, Gokul and Shanta, are often seen flirting with each other at the work in the cafeteria, in the cubicles, and some common office spaces, right? They seem to be in a consensual romantic relationship. A few of the other office employees who have observed this behavior feel embarrassed when around them and start avoiding these spaces and these two individuals, right? Now, is this sexual harassment? Any explanations or guesses?
Go ahead, Sridhar.
Yes, sir. I think that this can't be classified as sexual harassment, as the fact that if you can't force the employees to talk to someone they don't like in this situation, their conduct may be a little biased towards them, but unless and until they are not stopping them from doing anything or disrespecting them in any way, I don't think that sexual harassment is applicable here.
Shivani, you can go next.
Okay.
Good morning, sir. Sir, I believe that it would be a case of sexual harassment because, sir, I think the conduct of both the parties will not be acceptable in the office environment, and it become very uncomfortable for others to react in this way. So I think it would be a case of sexual harassment.
So, but do you think that the conduct here satisfies these elements?
Sir, I don't think it's on this part it become it's satisfied, but the point is the act of both the parties, I think it's not permissible in the workplace environment, and it is not acceptable in that situation. So on that context, I believe that it would be a case.
Okay. So sure. So see, what you're saying is not wrong in the sense that you don't expect your colleagues to engage in openly flirtatious behavior, right? So now this type of issue can be quite subjective. Now, if their behavior is merely exchanging glances, talking a lot with each other, occasionally the guy saying, "Oh, you're looking very nice today," right? It might be very difficult to say that it's sexually inappropriate. You could very well argue that this is inappropriate workplace conduct under some other policy, correct? But it might be difficult to argue that this consensual relationship between these two people is amounting to sexual harassment of their other colleagues, correct? Now, again, something like this can be quite subjective. If the behavior was of a more explicit nature, correct? It's went beyond in very public displays of physical affection. There, someone could say that this is now sexually inappropriate behavior in a sense in the workplace, and it's creating an offensive work environment for the others. So something like this can be quite subjective. Bear that in mind. But you're right in the sense that there could be a general policy code of conduct which states that employees should behave professionally and conduct themselves in a particular manner in the workplace, right? By all means, that policy might be violated here. But we always have to be mindful, as I said, as to categorizing some behavior as being generally harassing or because sexual harassment takes a very serious connotation and has a special procedure to deal with under the law, correct? So we need to be careful about that. Now let's look at the next example. Gauri and Sanjeev are co-workers who have a consensual relationship outside of the workplace. Gauri decides to end the relationship and tells, sorry, it has to be Sanjeev, not to speak with her again. Sanjeev, in an effort to win her back, starts passing romantic notes to her. Is this sexual harassment? Any volunteers?
Anjali, you can go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, sir. So I believe this is not sexual harassment because it is a consensual thing and they both were already in a relation and have developed a bond. So I think
they ended the relationship, right?
But if it's done in within the permissible limits, so I don't think that is that would count as sexual harassment at any point until and unless it is making the other person uncomfortable.
So when you say permissible limits, what do you mean?
So I mean, like if for as the background is already given that they were already known and were in a relationship, so feelings were there, and if it ended, so the other person is trying, and that I think that's permissible because it is not like he is not doing something that like irritates her or creates uncomfortable situation for the other person. It's just a initiative, so I don't think that would amount to sexual harassment.
So let's assume here that Gauri says, this is, I do not appreciate such conduct.
Thereafter, we can say that yes, it is coming under that ambit.
Okay. Does anyone else have any views?
Yeah, Rishabh, you can go next.
Sir, I believe this is a case of interference with the environment of the workplace. And the consensual relationship which Gauri and Sanjeev had, it was outside the workplace. And like the afterwards, when he was passing romantic notes, it was pretty much in the workspace, and that would amount to sexual harassment.
Okay. So over here, the two elements that I wanted to bring out is, like you said, there could be personal relationships within or outside the workplace. But if they have a knock-on effect on the workplace, right, then it could very well fall within the ambit of sexual harassment, right? And the other thing over here which matters, and I think the first answer was on those lines, what matters is the perception of the person making the complaint, right? That becomes paramount. It might be difficult for Sanjeev over here to say that, I was only very harmlessly trying to send her romantic notes, nothing that I haven't done before. But if she is moved away from the relationship, she finds that to be inappropriate, right? And there are in fact been rulings where they have said repeated proposals of marriage amounts to sexual harassment, right? Then it could fall into the ambit of sexual harassment here. What matters, and as a principle, it's important, is the perception of the victim is relevant to understand, correct? Now, you also have to be cautious about oversensitive victims who might say that something which is very harmless is like sexual harassment. So you have to, of course, be balanced in your view. It has to be a reasonable person's view. But the reasonable person's view of the victim and their perception is important to bear in mind. So let's move on to deal with a few other core definitions. What is the workplace, right? Because this whole law deals with prevention of sexual harassment at the workplace. Now, workplace can be defined into places which are inside and outside the workplace, which are pretty easy to understand. So anything within your office, four boundaries, office desk, toilets, canteens, all of that is pretty much your workplace. Could be outside the course of workplace, such as in the course of employment, right? You're traveling, you visit clients, customers, you take transport, stay in hotels for business purposes. All of that is outside the physical confines of your workplace, but it's in the course of your employment. Now, where they could also be, because of how Section 3 is worded, conduct which is not even in the workplace or in the course of employment, right? But still falling within the ambit of workplace sexual harassment if the complaint of conduct creates an intimidating or hostile work environment for the victim going forward. So let's take a look at this case study. Anusha is a member of the HR team and usually commutes to and from work by cab. One evening, Amit, who is in the sales team, offers to drop her home in his car. Anusha accepts the offer, right? On the way to her house, Amit professes his admiration for Anusha and asks her to join him for dinner at a restaurant. Anusha is not comfortable with this and refuses the invitation. Despite this, Amit drives to the restaurant and takes away Anusha's phone to prevent her from booking a cab. Next day, Anusha files a complaint of sexual harassment. So, can she file a complaint and with whom?
Yeah, Anjali, you can go ahead, please.
So I think that Anusha can file a complaint to the HR department, the office, like the head of the HR department, or maybe she can have a mail to them.
So can you elaborate your question answer? Is this meeting the elements of the definitions that we've discussed so far?
Sir, I think yes, it means, because in this coming and going from the workplace come under the ambit of the workplace environment only. Second, it is causing inconvenience to the other person. Third, the perception of the other person is being is also counted. So I think this will come under the definition of sexual harassment.
Okay. Does anyone else have, sorry, does anyone else have any other views?
Amira, you can go next, please.
Thank you, sir. So as per my understanding, it does amount to sexual harassment, but I am doubtful if she can report this to the HR, to the office, since Amit was not offering her a cab ride in his professional capacity. It was much more of a personal invitation. And similarly, Anusha did not have a professional compulsion to go with Amit. She could have, refused him. So although this does amount to sexual harassment, I'm doubtful if she can report it to the HR of the company.
I would like to add a point to what Amiradi said. Sir, don't we count this under vicarious liability of the company, that it is the duty of the company to ensure that the person is coming and going within the time limits of the organizational hours? Like, I think, and if we look in that perspective, this commuting to the office to and fro will be a part of that only, until unless it was another plan.
Okay. No, so I enjoy the discussion on this, right? And these are exactly meant to elucidate thinking, right, into this. And very often you find these types of defenses come up, correct? In this set of circumstances, we need to note here that they are both working for the same organization, correct? What Amit did was, in the course of dropping her to home in his car, which he would have otherwise normally done with the cab, right? And which should have been very much treated as something in the course of employment, correct? Now you've got someone who is commuting back to work, and during that you had another workplace colleague effectively harass you, right? Try and hit on you, snatch away your phone, make you feel confined, right? And potentially sexually vulnerable. So in that context, I think it's fair to argue in these sets of facts that not only did it occur in the course of employment, even if it were to be argued that it did not occur in the course of employment, the fact that they work in the same organization might be a argument to make over here, to say that, people in the HR team and the sales team have to interact with each other from time to time. The HR team interacts with most people in the organization, and his behavior would effectively, his presence in the office and his behavior towards her would create an uncomfortable work environment for her, correct? The complaint would normally be filed with the internal committee, and that's the aspect of law that we need to bear in mind. The law lays down some very special procedures on dealing with sexual harassment that we'll get to, right? But let's look at few more case studies in the context of what amounts to a workplace, especially given a lot of us are now working remotely, correct? Now, let's look at each of these examples. In the first one, every Sunday, now these are all work from home employees. Every Sunday during the past 3 weeks, Shashank has been asking his colleague Malvika to watch Friends with Benefits with him on Netflix party, right? This one example. The other one is Parag is making lewd comments on his colleagues Rohit's Instagram photos. The third one is Alia is attending an online conference on behalf of the company. Zubin, another participant in the conference, sends her lewd messages in a private chat. Now, each of these instances, can you try and correlate it with the discussion we've had so far and try and give me your views on whether you believe it amounts to sexual harassment or not?
Anjali, you can go ahead, please.
Sir, I think in these three examples also sexual harassment is included. And if I'm not wrong, few days back there was this newspaper article in which it also quoted that it was a conference call going on, like a video call, and one of the like associate was not dressed appropriately, and there were also cases against that the person was not behaving properly on the video calls because in this work from home environment. So I think all of these are under the ambit of sexual harassment at workplace, because we are not physically in that workplace, but the environment in which we work right now is the considered to be the workplace for us, because you're not going to the premises of the office, but the premise where you are living is the office for you. So I think that all amounts to workplace.
So even the second example here, do you think amounts to workplace sexual harassment?
So the Instagram one.
Yeah.
So because I believe that, in my opinion, because these days companies, to promote their advertisements and to show that yes, we are in unity, they all connect each other. So I think that also that will also be a example of workplace. And I might be wrong, but it's just in that perspective, because as you have seen that LinkedIn profiles, people or companies project because they are not coming to the office. So these days more people are connecting to on social media to showcase that to present their company.
So this is his colleague's personal profile. Rohit has posted some Instagram photos and Parag has made some comments. So firstly, bear in mind that this is a law designed to protect women. Now, assuming this company did not have a gender neutral policy, would that?
I still think that will amount to sexual harassment, because they were friends or they have known each other from the same workplace, right? They are like,
no,
they
but
have
the victim here is the alleged victim here is a male employee.
So, but no, I am clueless, sir. Sorry.
No problem. Anyone else has any thoughts on this?
Astha, you can go next.
Yes, good afternoon, sir. Sir, according to me, sir, I guess the Netflix one doesn't amount to sexual harassment, sir, because it's Sunday, and normally we see the normal circumstances on Sunday, the companies and or the workplace remains closed. So in that case, if we say it doesn't amount to in the course of employment, is not even in the course of employment and not even the workplace, even if we are going for the online or the work from home category. So it's on their own behalf, their own personal friendship or whatever it is, their relationship. So I don't think so it amounts to sexual harassment. And also in relation to the Instagram one, I don't think so, sir, because it's again their personal matter. It is not like what Anjali said, that if it has been on LinkedIn, then it could have amount to sexual harassment. But since it's Instagram and it's not related to work in any matter, even not in the course of the employment, so it shouldn't amount to sexual harassment. And also, sir, since Rohit is a male, so and since the sexual harassment is a female driven act, so if the company had a policy that is gender neutral, and if it would have been in the course of the employment, then the Rohit would have got any remedy or something. But in this case, I don't think so.
So let me put it this way. Now, if I were to elaborate these facts and tell you that all of these people are close colleagues, they work with each other on a regular basis, correct? And for the sake of argument, for the second example, let's make Rohit into a woman and let's call her Shilpa. Right? So again, they're all close colleagues. They work with each other on a day-to-day basis. Does that change your perception?
So again, if it would have been in the course of the employment, so I don't think so that making comments on the Instagram like amounts to in the course of the employment, work in the course of the employment. If it would have been related to any work, then I guess it would definitely would have amount to. But in this case, I'm just confused. I don't think, according to me, it doesn't. So yeah.
Okay. So everyone is clear that the third case is pretty clear, right? It's a conference that you're attending on behalf of the company, and someone sends a lewd comment during the conference. Correct. So that's a pretty straightforward example of what amounts to harassment in the workplace, in the middle of a conference. The first two ones are a lot more subjective, correct? And there it matters to a great extent as to whether the conduct complained of, right, has any potential ongoing impact on the workplace as well, on their professional interactions, right? That's going to be an important assessment to make here, which will have to be gleaned from the person's complaint themselves. It might not be easy to assume in these cases, right? So if let's say Parag made a lewd comment on Shilpa's Instagram photo, right? And Shilpa says, I work with this person on a daily basis. The moment he started doing this, right, and he's made this one comment, now I cannot continue to work with him. I understand and I know that he views me in a manner which is making me extremely uncomfortable, right? I never knew he had these kinds of designs on me. So it just makes it difficult for me to work with this person anymore. And therefore his conduct has made the work environment for me very difficult because he's my colleague and I interact with him on a regular day-to-day basis. Same goes for the first one. So these might not have been instances that occurred in the direct course of employment, but that's where I talked about this situation where it might be outside the course of employment. But if it creates an intimidating or hostile work environment for the person, it might still fall within the ambit of sexual harassment, right? So this is where you need to be mindful of how Section 3 can play a very big role in expanding the ambit and circumstances in which things might fall within the ambit of workplace sexual harassment. Now, let's look at some of the procedural aspects of sexual harassment. An internal committee, right? Now, this is what has been picked primarily from the Vishaka ruling, which has laid down the broad framework basis which sexual harassment matters have to be dealt with in an organization. So every organization with 10 or more employees, for each of its offices with 10 or more individuals, has to create a internal committee. This internal committee must be headed by a senior woman employee. It must have a couple of other employees who are committed to the cause of women, at least 2 others, and an external member from an NGO or an association who is committed to the cause of women, right? So this is the minimum committee composition, 4 members. It could be larger. At least 1/2 of the members have to be women, and the committee has to be sort of reconstituted after everyone has completed 3 years tenure on it, correct? So this is the basic requirement for every organization. They need to create a committee. They need to communicate the committee composition to their employees and give details of the committee members to everyone so that they can be approached and complaints of sexual harassment can be filed and inquired into. Now let's take a very simple example. An individual raises claims of sexual harassment against an employee of Toogle India as part of the Me Too campaign, and also tags the internal committee of Toogle India, right? So this is probably on Twitter. Now the complainant has said that she is an employee, but has not mentioned her name or any other details, correct? Can the internal committee of Toogle India take up the complaint against this employee based on an anonymous complaint? Any thoughts on that? This has happened quite a lot. There are actually live examples of people who have anonymously posted on Twitter and raised allegations against X person, Y person, saying that I used to work in this organization, and while I was there, Mr. X, regularly harassed me, right? Now, what does the Indian sexual harassment law say, and is it possible to to take cognizance of such matters? Anyone has any ideas, thoughts on this?
Vishaka, you can go ahead, please.
So I think it should be investigated into, because ultimately it's a welfare legislation and it is valid that women want to be anonymous while giving a complaint. So I think the allegations must be looked into.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other thoughts on this?
Sharanya, you can go next. Sharanya, your voice is not audible. Okay. Amira, you can go ahead. I think there's some issue with Sharanya, I think.
So I think the internal committee can look into the complaint, and after they have been able to sort of understand whether the complaint made is genuine or it is authentic in nature or not, and they should look into the matter.
Okay.
Because as said by my previous fellow member, that mostly women do prefer to remain anonymous while filing such complaints.
Okay. So see, that's what most organizations would want to do in this case, right? You're not wrong. But let's remember also that the Sexual Harassment Act, the way it's written up, actually does not facilitate filing of anonymous complaints. The manner in which the law is written up, it says explicitly that the victim has to come forward, file a complaint in writing, submit 6 copies of that complaint to the internal committee, and that complaint has to be shared with the accused for him to provide his defense and explanation, correct? So the manner in which the law is written up actually doesn't, like I said, facilitate or allow anonymous complaints to come forward. It states that these complaints have to be inquired into in accordance with the rules of natural justice. Now, because of that, if you do take up anonymous complaints, there is a very real possibility that the person who's accused of harassment might say, this is rubbish. There is no way I can defend myself against an anonymous complainant. How do I know whether the allegations are true? How do I question any evidence that they may have presented? I would like to cross question them or the witnesses they're producing. I can't do that when I'm dealing with an anonymous complainant, correct? On the same, in the same way, and if I do not take it up, there is also a risk that the victim might ultimately allege that the company has not taken any action, correct? So therefore, in these types of situations, it becomes very important for your policy to be very clear as to what your position is going to be. Most organizations, because of how the law is written up, right, and because of the specific requirements in its rules, which say that there has to be written complaints, etc., will want to insist that anyone who wants to file a sexual harassment complaint comes forward and identify themselves. This has to be, of course, coupled with adequate employee sensitization, because they also need to know that if they are filing a complaint, then they cannot do it anonymously and they cannot hide behind the veil of anonymity to sort of raise these allegations and then not participate, right? At the same time, there could be legitimate reasons why someone doesn't want to come forward, in which case organizations have a very tight rope to walk. In some instances, I've seen they try and then deal with the matter as a general harassment matter, right? Outside the ambit of this law, where you're not strictly bound by these rules to have the IC investigate it or have these complaints received in writing, etc. Again, but that comes with a significant amount of legal risk. It's not something that you have the ability to do without any form of without any kind of legal risk, right? So you can either sort of counsel the employees to come forward and agree to participate in the inquiry. If they are not participating in the inquiry, then you need to decide, whether or not you want to take it forward, and if so, whether you will take it up as a general harassment matter. And if the victim is not coming forward, if just an anonymous complaint saying I was sexually harassed, there's no further communication or interaction with them, no one else seems to suggest that anything was out of place with that person against whom the accusations have been made, then you might in fact decide to drop it, correct? But remember that in the Indian law, the expectation is that the victim will come forward and it will not be an anonymous complaint. Let's look at this case study, after which I'd like to sort of wind down. Anusha works in company A and Ayush works for company B. Now, they're two different organizations. They both are in the same building, and they share a cafeteria space, right? So this guy Ayush from company B comes to company A's cafeteria during lunchtime regularly. Now on Valentine's Day, Ayush proposes to Anusha in company A's cafeteria, and Anusha rejects his proposal, right? Now Ayush tries holding her hand in an attempt to convince her. The next day, Anusha files a complaint of sexual harassment with company A's internal committee, since the incident took place in company A's cafeteria. Now, can the company A's internal committee take up the complaint? Anyone has any thoughts on this? I know I'm over schedule. We'll try and wind up within the next 5 minutes if that's all right. And if there are any questions after that.
Ameera, you can go.
So as per my understanding, company A will not be able to take in the complaint since Ayush is not an employee of company A. And the internal committee precisely means that both the victim as well as the accused have to belong to the same company.
Okay, that's an interesting answer. Partly right. The concept over here is that the victim doesn't necessarily have to be your employee, right? You could have a situation where even a visitor to your premise might be harassed by your employee, correct? You still have an obligation to then take action based on that visitor's complaint. However, the law does say that you have the obligation to take up a matter only when the person against whom the accusations are made, i.e. the respondent, is your employee, right? So over here, Ayush doesn't work in company A at all. It might be argued to be sexual harassment, course of employment, workplace, all of that exists. But over here, company A doesn't have any sort of disciplinary authority on Ayush at all. Correct. So even if it's an internal committee were to conduct an investigation into it, it might not be able to compel company B to take action, correct? Because company B has not participated in the proceedings. Company B might not know how the internal committee has examined the matter, whether it's done it fairly or not. Ayush might argue that it had no jurisdiction. So this is another complexity of the law that very often organizations have to deal with. And this is something to bear in mind, as lawyers. The principle is that Section 11 of the law says that the company's IC will have to take up the matter when the respondent is an employee, right? And not necessarily the victim. So few other aspects to bear in mind. I think we've just talked about the jurisdiction point through the last case study, right? So where let's say the accusation is against a third party, right? Then typically the accused will have to, the complainant will either have to file a complaint with the police authorities or take it up with the employer of the actual accused, right? Whoever the employer may be, or potentially, seek out other external remedies, right? But it will be quite difficult for that person's employer, the victim's employer itself, to take up the matter, at least successfully, because even if they do take up the matter, their findings and their recommendations may not really be easy to enforce and binding against the employer of the actual accused. Other aspects to keep in mind, complaints have to be filed in a time-bound manner. there's a limitation period of 3 months, which could be extended by another 3 months if there are reasonable grounds for it. But and we saw all this while the Me Too issue was, very fresh. You found that people made accusations of sexual harassment that went back years even, correct? The Priya Rimani and MJ Akbar case was in a sense that, where Priya Rimani came out with her experiences of harassment that dated back many years, correct? And she was accused of defamation by MJ Akbar. In the context of the Sexual Harassment Act and the workplace, the victims will have to file complaints within that limitation period. If it's beyond that limitation period and the company and through IC takes up the matter, there is going to be a significant risk that the accused could challenge those proceedings as being violative of the law, correct? It can again be one of those tightropes which organizations have to figure out what to do. Nobody wants to have somebody accused of harassment in their workplace, but at the same time, there is a law that you have to comply with, right? So in these types of situations, often companies try and see if the complaint is outside the limitation period, then can they deal with it as a non-sexual harassment issue, provided that it's a wider complaint and there are other elements of it which aren't just specifically sexual harassment related, but they also relate to other aspects of work, of harassment. The other aspects to bear in mind is there is a 90-day timeline within which an inquiry has to be completed. Mens rea or intention isn't really a relevant factor in the context of internal sexual harassment matters. Of course, in a criminal proceeding under the IPC, that could be a relevant issue. But when it comes to internal disciplinary matters, it's more to do with the perception of the victim and whether there is a ability to show based on preponderance of probabilities that the alleged conduct did occur. Right now, these are the types of actions that the law prescribes. You could, depending on the severity of the misconduct, right? It could be anywhere from written warnings to termination and suspension, right? And anywhere in between, counseling, withholding pay or increments, promotions, etc. The last point I wanted to touch upon was false and malicious complaints. The law has expressly recognized the fact that there could be situations where people are trying to settle scores, right, by filing false complaints. We see that sometimes where, people, victims come forward, alleged victims come forward saying they've been sexually harassed by their managers, and the managers typically try and say that, there is no truth to that. I gave this person a bad performance rating, or I gave them negative feedback on some of the work that they turned in. And, the next thing I know is they are accusing us of sexual harassment, right? There is no truth to it. Now, if there is indeed a false or a malicious complaint, then the law permits the organization to discipline the person who made such a false complaint. They could also be potentially dismissed from employment. However, a mere inability to substantiate a complaint in itself will not make it false or malicious. The internal committee will have to come to an independent finding of the fact that indeed there was a false complaint, correct? Based on documents, records, etc. So, but yes, I mean, the idea is that the law wants genuine complainants to come forward and gives them the ability to seek redressal, and at the same time deter people from making malicious complaints, because as I mentioned earlier, sexual harassment accusations can have very serious consequences for people involved. Of course, the victims are in a bad position because of having suffered such conduct. But if somebody is falsely accused, right, then that person could also be in a very bad situation. These types of accusations, as we saw, are career damaging. Right, you might not just lose your job, you might lose your complete professional career with in an inability to be employed if you're actually accused of serious sexual harassment, correct? So that sort of brings us to a conclusion of this session, covering the highlights of this law. There are other elements to this, very procedural, which is probably not appropriate for me to spend time on, given what we are covering. Other element to bear in mind is confidentiality obligations are pretty strong under this law. So all the communication, the complaints, the proceedings, all of these have to be maintained strictly confidential. And any attempts to sort of talk about it in a public forum, etc., can be treated as offenses in themselves. So let's spend a few more minutes if anyone has any questions, and then we can wind up the session.
After you can go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. I have a doubt. Sir, I guess my voice is echoing.
I can hear you. Go on.
Okay. Yes, sir. So my doubt is based on a situation. The situation being that if the employees of an organization are holding a party that is actually outside the organization to celebrate some work achievement or something like that. So, and in that party, the sexual harassment occurs of a woman by any of her colleague. So in that case, can the complaint be filed with the internal committee? Since it's outside.
Why don't you try and attempt to answer your question on your own, based on the principles I've talked about?
Sir, I was thinking that it can be filed, sir, because first of all, the party is comprised of all the colleagues, of all the employees, and second, it's relating to a work achievement that is related to their work only. So I guess according to me, it should be filed with the internal committee.
You're right.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Any other questions?
Dr. Rissam, you can go ahead, please.
Atul, how do you see the comment of the CGA suggesting the rapist to marry the minor girl a few days back?
Well, apparently he's clarified he's not made such a comment, but yeah, I do think, this is my personal view, something like this is really out of place. I think it just points to a very regressive mentality that, you can rape somebody and then just because you choose to marry them, irrespective of whether they want to or not, you're absolved of a crime. So I certainly don't agree with it. Short summary. And if indeed such a statement has been made, that kind of mindset should not be echoed by the remainder of our judiciary. I think that'll be very, very problematic for us as a country.
Right. I want to add something more. Why I asked you this question, because having discussed all this for last more than 1 hour, if we get some kind of such kind of in fact suggestions from the CGA, I think somewhere whole system seems diluting and collapsing at the hand of the person who should defend it at the utmost, in the utmost manner.
Absolutely, you're right. I mean, it'll be like a blanket check to people to say that, I can go ahead, do what I want with impunity if I'm willing to thereafter throw up my hands and say I'm willing to, marry this person, then somehow I'm not guilty. That's a very, very regressive mindset.
Yeah, right. Thank you so much.
Shivani, you can go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. Sir, I have a doubt regarding this. So, sir, I think according to my point of view, I think I might be wrong in this point, but I think when we are satisfying the ingredients of Section 2 and Section 3, so, sir, it becomes more subjective, because I have seen in many case studies today. So, that do you think that because of this, the justice will automatically suffer, and not because of the point of view of the man, but also from the point of view of a woman as well? So, what's your say on this?
Could you elaborate, please? I am not sure I fully follow your train of thought there. I mean, these matters are certainly subjective, correct?
Yeah, so I'm now.
It's not black and white.
Yeah, so sir, I just wanted to ask that because of this subjectiveness in the cases, do you think that justice will ultimately suffer? Because there are situations when the court seems that there can be a case of sexual harassment, but there are some in the similar situation. The another court said that there can be situation there won't be a situation of sexual harassment. So I think from my point of view, it can be very problematic because ultimately the accused or the victim will ultimately suffer on his part.
No, you're absolutely right in the sense that because of the subjectivity associated with this topic, right? There is a potential. I'm not saying it always happens. There is a potential that an overzealous internal committee will take a particular position which is harmful, right, or probably unfair, and that's where training becomes crucial, correct? And it becomes important to try and look at these matters not emotionally, but basis as much as possible objective information, data, narratives, correct? And you shouldn't let preconceived notions and morals come into the picture. You have to look at it in the context of the people that you're dealing with. I've had instances where, there were youngsters right out of colleges who joined organizations, right? And what they found as acceptable behavior was very, very different from what members on the internal committee, who were all in their late 50s or 60s, right, found, correct, as acceptable behavior. So you need to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the people that you're dealing with, right, and have an open mindset. Do not let preconceived notions come into play. But that's true generally of all subjective disputes before any judge or judiciary. So so sexual harassment is frankly no different, correct? So there is, I think, some risk, like you said, of miscarriage of justice, but it can be addressed through regular and good training, exercises which help you train your judicial mind, and try and look at problems objectively, right? Situations as objectively as possible, rather than based on preconceived notions and theories and philosophies which might be very unique to you alone and not to others. And the fact that there is a committee, right, and there is external members plus multiple people who have to sort of come together and form a consensus is in a way a sort of an internal check and balance mechanism that has been put in, so that one person's views do not hopefully sort of color the judgment of the entire committee.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much, sir. So I have another doubt, but this is for my yesterday's class. So can I ask right now or sometime later?
This is for your?
So from a last class, I have a doubt from last class. So can I ask right now?
Let's finish off with the sexual harassment questions, if any, and then you can raise that.
Yeah, of course, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, Amira, you can go ahead.
Sir, correct me if I'm wrong, but mostly I've seen in sexual harassment cases that the company tries to file a non-disclosure agreement with the victim, and they try to suppress the matter, especially if it's against someone from who's holding a senior position in the company, sir. So, sir, in such a situation, how can we amend the law, or how can we can strengthen the law which can counter such situations where the victim is forced to sign an NDA or justice is not achieved?
So see, I think you're referring to international news items on this probably more than Indian, where globally we have seen situations where companies come to some form of settlement with the victim, right? And they say that this is a confidential settlement, and you will not talk about this outside. In the Indian context, we don't see that happen too often. if it's a matter that has come up before the internal committee, you will have to look at it through the internal committee procedure, which is a confidential procedure, no means. We're not then talking about signing settlements or anything of that kind. There is one aspect of the procedure which is a conciliation, where at the victim's own request, and this is explicitly laid down in the law, so this is not something that a company is trying to push, but the law says that if a victim wants to conciliate the matter with the accused, the internal committee can facilitate such conciliation. And if they do arrive at a conciliation, that can be recorded through a conciliation agreement or a settlement agreement, which is then meant to be confidential, right? So the Indian law is recognizing that possibility, provided the victim herself on her own seeks such conciliation. She is not forced into it, correct? I have always advised my clients that if there is no request for a conciliation, you have looked at the matter as the internal committee and come to a recommendation, right? That this person is accused, Mr. X is guilty and he needs to be disciplined. After that, do not try and come to any form of settlements of any kind with the parties. Let's say he's a very senior guy in the organization and he says, can I, instead of being disciplined, can I enter into a private settlement? We do not recommend that these types of situations be encouraged or allowed.
Thank you, sir.
So we have just 5 minutes left. I have to jump off for a client call at 3 sharp. So maybe 1 or 2 more questions and then we can wind up for today.
Panya, you can go.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Sir, what did you think of the allegations that were put against CGI Ranjan Gogoi? Sir, do you think because in the panel had said that an independent panel had been consisted for the same, and even though the complainant had said that it was a hostile environment in which she was not allowed to have her own lawyer present there, she was withdrawn from the investigation after a point of time. So what are your views on the same?
Yeah, I felt when I mean, this is some time back, I did feel this was quite an aggressive view. Do bear in mind that the Act makes it clear, and it's explicitly laid down in the rules, that neither party, either the victim or the accused, can be represented by a lawyer, right? So rules under the Sexual Harassment Act are in fact saying that you have no inherent right to bring in an external lawyer and be represented by that person. They may not have technically violated any law there, but yeah, I mean, I generally felt that was a bit of an aggressive position taken by the court in that case.
Right, sir. Thank you.
Maybe another question and then we have to close for today.
I think there's no more else, Atul. We can close it.
Okay, sure. There was somebody who had a question about yesterday's session.
Yes, sir. So am I audible now?
Yeah, sure, but it'll have to be short because I have like literally 2 minutes.
Yes, sir. So basically, I have a doubt from the case study, which is of Hemant, who is got terminated because of a police complaint has been filed by his wife because of domestic violence. So I just wanted to ask, sir, I think in most of the cases when the person seeking for a job, the companies would try to be check on a background check. So sir, can we relate with this point? Because as you said in the answer that we can't prove him, we can't say that the person is accused until proven guilty. So can we relate it with this point or is something else?
So yesterday's case study about this person being accused of domestic violence and the company terminating him, right? The point exactly was that if you're dismissing somebody without an inquiry, right, you're casting a stigma on them, and when the moment you do that, it becomes difficult for them to find another job outside, correct?
Yes.
So which is also the reason why the law generally doesn't permit you to terminate somebody purely on the basis of the fact, on the basis that they might be subject to some external criminal proceeding, correct? You'll need to either show there is a correlation between that and the work environment, or that he's violated some other internal policies, or find some other reason to terminate them, such as absence from work because of being engaged or caught up in jail or something like that, right? But yes, I mean, clearly, if he's dismissed for something like this and that creates a black mark on his service record, it is going to become a difficult task for him to find another job, right? And that's also the reason why something like this is subject to legal challenge, correct? Any dismissal by the company is subject to legal challenge.
Thank you so much, sir, for this.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I would need to end the session for today. I look forward to our last session tomorrow, and to your participation in the same. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye. Kanish, shall we hang up? Huh?